Welcome back everyone to the second last video in the Russia country series. We have been on quite an adventure from basically the formation of Russia, the whole history of the Tsarist period, up to World War I, the overthrow of the Tsar, the Russian Revolution, and now we have arrived at the Russian Civil War. This is a video by CallMeEzekiel. It's done in the country ball style, which I guess it's a popular thing. And I hadn't seen this channel before. I wanted to throw this one in extra because it was recommended to me a long time ago. Never have quite gotten around to it, and I figured, you know what, hey, we ended last time oversimplified with the Russian Revolution and the upcoming, it sort of breezed over the Russian Civil War, the difference between the Reds and the Whites, and that was really about it. So I figured, hey, let's go into a little bit more detail and check out this channel as well. Yeah. That's about all I got to say. The next video, oh, also it's in two parts, so there's going to be an edit in the middle here, but anyways. Yeah, the final video will be Geography Now, Russia, and that will sort of encapsulate everything, and we'll talk about the culture of Russia and everything like that, and yeah, that's going to be it for me. I will then put out a poll for what the next country series will be, so check that one out on YouTube. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Without further ado, let's get into it.
The Bolsheviks have conquered Russia, everywhere from Vladivostok to St. Petersburg.
Oh, what is... Ugh. Okay.
From Arkhangelsk to the Caucasus are red. This was not accomplished through war or elections, but by revolution. There were those who resisted, nationalists along the periphery, and the Germans with whom Russia was still at war. But in the eyes of the Bolsheviks, the greatest threat were the Cossacks of the Don, who raised an army of 40,000 men to oppose them. The counter-revolution has revealed itself, and the Bolsheviks are ready for it. Late in November of 1917, the Red Guard were dispatched to deal with the threat. By the end of January, the Cossacks were scattered. Of course they were. How could any force possibly stand against the world communist revolution? Lenin announced to the Moscow Soviet, it can be said with certainty that in the main, the Civil War has ended.
Nope.
So that was it. The Civil War was over. The Bolsheviks were masters of Russia. But there was just one problem. The Civil War wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. So you can call me Ezekiel. This is the Russian Civil War. Let's jump in. As the
Okay. Sorry.
Cossacks of the Don fled the Red Guard, a few thousand Tsarists, led by General Kornilov, were forced to flee south into the Kuban steppe. This would be known to history as the Ice March.
Okay, sorry. This really gets into it very quickly. As you might remember, right, Russia at this point, it used to be a Tsarist regime. It was overthrown in a revolution. Eventually, the Bolsheviks came out on top, and they, well, yeah, they were the most powerful party. They held elections, which they actually lost to the basically social democrats, so to say. And this then led to them sort of installing the authoritarian system that we would eventually come to see. However, not everyone was happy of this. There was a coalition of conservatives, nationalists, liberals, social democrats, you know, even anarchist functions, and people loyal to the Tsar as well, that became the Whites. And so that's what this is talking about right here, right? The warring factions here are the communists, right? Those that are loyal to the Bolshevik cause specifically, and not the Menshevik cause, and pretty much everyone else. The difference here is that the Reds, they control a lot of the economic heartland, and the Whites control, although more territory, it's not has as much economic might as the Reds do. Just wanted to give that little brief introduction.
For 80 days, these men fought against cold, privation, and the Red Guard to secure a home base for their counter-revolution. This campaign nearly met a disastrous end at the siege of Ekaterinodar. The day before Kornilov was going to launch the final assault, which would have probably failed, artillery hit his headquarters and killed him. The surviving generals gathered around their leader's corpse. One of them, General Alexeyev, turned to the man that would be Kornilov's successor and told him, "You have inherited a heavy burden. May God help you." That man's name was Anton Denikin. With a little over 3,500 men, he had to liberate all of Russia. Denikin called off the siege and marched back to the Don. The situation there had changed since they'd left, and Denikin was going to take full advantage. Meanwhile, in Siberia, the 40,000 men of the Czechoslovak Legion were riding trains east to Vladivostok. They were once POWs, captured from Austria-Hungary during the war, but many Czechs and Slovaks were nationalists, more inclined to fight against their imperial masters than for them. The Russians knew this, and so gave these men a choice. They could either spend the rest of the war rotting in a Russian POW camp, or they could join the Russian army and fight to liberate their homeland. But now that the Bolsheviks were in charge, Russia was about to leave the war, so the Legion traveled to Vladivostok, hoping that the Allies could ship them to France. As it turned out, the Bolsheviks didn't like having 40,000 angry foreigners travel along their empire's key artery. They harassed the Legion at every opportunity. At the station of Chelyabinsk, they even arrested them. In response, the Legion seized the town and refused to give it back until their brothers were freed.
Yeah, and so the key point here is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire still exists, right? So Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which would become Czechoslovakia, Hungary does not exist at this point, right? So these are POWs that, although they're represented here with the Czech flags, the modern Czech flag, the modern Slovakian flag, these countries actually at this point do not exist because the war is not over, right? So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is still fighting on. The state is basically almost collapsed, but they are still fighting. As long as I'm following the dates here correctly, this would be in 1918. It isn't until November the 11th, 1918 that the armistice is signed, and then, we might be able to get into the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the next country series. We'll see. Depends on what you guys vote for.
When Soviet leadership heard about this incident, they panicked and ordered the Red Guard to disarm.
This is like very specific details, but like there's no broader picture yet. So usually I say sometimes like, I wish there was more details, but this one it's like, whoa, slow down.
The Legion and force them into either the Bolshevik army or into work camps. This order was impossible. The Red Guard was barely an armed mob, and their leaders just ordered them to capture one of the most battle-hardened fighting forces on Earth.
Yeah.
As soon as the Czechoslovak Legion got wind of what was happening, they rose up all along the Trans-Siberian Railroad and captured it in just a couple of days. They then handed it all over to the Russian White Movement. And, as if the loss of Siberia to counter-revolutionaries wasn't bad enough, the Legion didn't leave Russia. Instead, the Allies landed over 100,000 troops in Siberia, plus more in the northern port of Arkhangelsk, and ordered the Legion to turn west.
Yeah, and so again, this really also gave more credence to the Bolshevik movement, saying like, look, these foreigners, which is obviously an easy cause to rally your people up against, these foreigners are invading us, right? They're trying to take over the Russian people, and so this was really a cause for people to side with the Bolsheviks, and was sort of a positive, I suppose, in Lenin's direction.
The Legion made it all the way to Kazan, capturing both the city and the gold reserves inside of it. They also pushed north to Yekaterinburg, but that advance would have far less happy consequences.
Okay, so that's where Yekaterinburg is.
You see,
cool.
Yekaterinburg was where the Bolsheviks were
also, I like how he's
keeping
using
the former
white
royal family prisoner. Up until now, the Bolsheviks were unsure about what to do with them, but with the Czechoslovak Legion approaching, a decision had to be made. At 2 a.m., the family was woken up and told that for their safety, they were being moved out of the city. The family and their servants, who volunteered to stay with them, got dressed. Nicholas then led the way while carrying Alexei, their hemophilic son, in his arms. Their captors crowded them into a basement. The family waited patiently until their lead captor made an announcement. Nicholas Alexandrovich, by order of the Regional Soviet of the Urals, you are to be shot, along with all your family. Nicholas was horrified, asking, "What?" They shot Nicholas first, then his son, and finally his wife and daughters and servants.
Terrible.
Shards of diamonds and precious jewels flew everywhere, as the women had concealed them in the linings of their dresses. Everyone was dead except for Anastasia, the youngest Romanov daughter. She cried out in fear, only having been slightly wounded, so one of the guards approached her and stabbed her twice with his bayonet.
Oh my
As
God.
the sun rose that morning, the bodies of the royal family were chopped up, burned, their bones dissolved in sulfuric acid, and the remains buried in a nearby mine shaft. The men who murdered the Romanovs were members of the Cheka, the predecessor to a whole alphabet soup of similar organizations that would terrorize the Soviet Union for decades to come. But the Cheka was not the only change that the Bolsheviks would make to Russia. Ending the war with Germany was perhaps the only unique Bolshevik political program that was popular in Russia.
True.
Accomplishing it was vital to the party's future. In the first round of negotiations, the Germans demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Soviets demanded Russia, and Russia demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Germans demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Soviets demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Germans demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Soviets demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Germans demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Soviets demanded Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The Germans 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 demanded Poland, Lithuania The Bolsheviks were outraged by this and wanted better terms, so to gain leverage, they implemented a policy of neither peace nor war. The idea was that they would refuse to sign any treaty with the Germans, but demobilize their own army as though they had. That would surely bring better terms, right? Naturally, with no opposition, the Germans just marched deeper into Russia. This forced the Bolsheviks back into negotiations. This time, the Germans demanded all of the previous territories, plus an independent Ukraine, Finland, Baltic, and Transcaucasus. Most of the Bolsheviks again wanted to seek better terms, but Lenin figured out that they had no idea what they were doing, so stepped in to force the peace. With the Germans finally gone, demobilization could be completed, and their attention focused on the Civil War. Events in Siberia had proved that the Red Guard...
And again, so this stripped Russia of 25% of their economic output and nearly 25% of their population, right? Stripping away Finland, Ukraine, Poland, all the other nations that were just listed there. That's huge amounts of economic activity as well as population that have now become independent. And then Stalin, decades later, would eventually push through the Baltics and reclaim all this territory. As well as there's the Soviet-Polish War that happens as well, just a few years after this, where Poland actually really, that was their first fight, not their first ever fight, but their first fight in the new Polish state for independence, which they actually succeeded and pushed back the Soviets and were able to remain an independent nation until Germany invaded on September 1st, 1939.
Wasn't working. Volunteer militias led by elected officers may have been useful for winning political battles, but they were militarily impotent. What the Bolsheviks needed was a large conscripted army led by a professional officer corps. Since they held all of the major cities, conscription wasn't a problem. But where could they find experienced officers? Well, Russia just demobilized one of the largest armies on Earth. The country was full of experienced officers, specifically ex-Tsarist officers. So the Bolsheviks took two measures to ensure their former enemies' loyalty. First was the commissar system. Contrary to the popular meme, the commissars were actually a very productive addition to the Red Army. They were great for morale, and more often than not maintained productive relationships with the officers they oversaw.
Interesting.
When moved between units, Soviet officers would frequently ask to have their commissars transferred with them. The other measure the Bolsheviks took was tracking each of the officers' familial relations. That way, they could be used as hostages if the officer considered defecting.
It was too nice there. There had to be something else, right?
Because of these reforms, the Red Army exploded in size, reaching 3 million men by October of 1919.
Wow, they were 3 million men.
Were armed with weapons taken from Russia's well-stocked armories and led by veteran officers, overseen by loyal, if somewhat corrupt, commissars. When the Red Army was sent out to retake Kazan, the Czechoslovaks couldn't resist them. The only people who could save Russia now were the Russians. Meanwhile, in the south, the Soviet occupation of the Don would prove to be short-lived. The Bolsheviks alienated the Cossacks so much that they raised another army of 40,000 troops. This time, they not only successfully held the Don, but even launched an offensive into traditionally Russian territory. It was during this campaign that Stalin made a name for himself defending the key city of Tsaritsyn. It would later be renamed to Stalingrad in his honor. When Denikin reached the Don, he grew his force to 9,000 men and launched a second Kuban campaign. This one proved to be much more successful than the Ice March, which is surprising since the Reds outnumbered the Whites by at least 8-1. Or at least it would be a surprise if you didn't know that his 9,000 men were, by far, the most elite force of the entire Russian Civil War. Over a third of them were experienced officers. In fact, this army was too elite. There were times when colonels had to perform the duties of privates. In any case, having achieved...
What? Why? Okay, anyways, let's keep going.
In full control of the Kuban, Denikin's forces grew to 40,000 men. And, even better, he wasn't the only white commander with a rapidly growing army. Up until now, the Siberian government centered in Omsk was made up of squabbling anti-Bolshevik socialists. They were pretty much in...
See, I wish that you could see the whole map of Russia to know exactly where Omsk is, because Siberia is ginormous, but anyways.
Entirely propped up by the Czechoslovaks. Change was needed, and that change would come from, of all places, the Russian Navy. Alexander Kolchak, an admiral, along with the help of sympathetic Cossacks, pretty much walked into Omsk, arrested its socialist government, and declared himself the supreme ruler of all Russia. The Siberian Whites loved this change. Officers who were unwilling to fight for socialists flooded into Kolchak's army, but the Czechoslovaks hated Kolchak. In fact, they were so disgusted by his coup that they left the front and joined the rest of the Allies in only guarding the Siberian rear. But Kolchak didn't need them anymore. The Allies were sending all the weapons he'd need to raise his own army. At over 100,000 men, Kolchak's White Army was the largest force the Bolsheviks would face in the entire Civil War. On March 4th of 1918, that army attacked westward. The Reds responded by strategically retreating closer to their supply hubs. So by April, Kolchak had advanced 250 miles. That may sound...
Thank you for a map. Okay, so that means that, all right, so they're pushing more west, back into the heartland. So I wonder here, but like, what's going on here in Estonia? I suppose that this is held by the Allies, for lack of a better word, sort of the foreign forces, and then they're being pushed back this way. Okay, there we go. See, they're much better with maps.
Sound impressive, but it was a terrible mistake. The Whites were only seizing thinly populated and under-industrialized territory, while doing little damage to the actual Red Army. They were also marching away from their own supply lines, which were being absolutely ravaged in the east. As it turned out, the Japanese, who provided over 70,000 of the Allied troops guarding Kolchak's rear, had an ulterior motive for being in Siberia. The Japanese were not in Siberia to fight communism, or to get Russia back into the World War. They were only there to secure their own interests in the region. To that end, they armed and financed Cossack warlords who ravaged the Siberian East.
Of course.
Even though the Allies were committed to fully supplying the Siberian White Army, most of that equipment never reached them.
And you have to remember too, there was the Sino-Japanese War, which Russia was embarrassingly defeated by, thinking that they could pick a fight with lowly Japan, which at this point was not considered the world power that it would become. And so for the Japanese to then further antagonize Russia is, I mean, kind of funny, but also makes sense given the chaos that's going on at this point. And is that when they seized, oh God, I don't remember off the top of my head, but maybe that's when they seized the half of that one small tip of Russia. Maybe you know what I'm talking about.
The brigands didn't steal disappeared into the pockets of corrupt officials. These were problems that Kolchak didn't know how to solve. The truth is that as an admiral, Kolchak had no experience with armies or politics. No one doubted Kolchak's commitment to the cause, but he just wasn't the right man for the job. When the Reds counterattacked, the Siberian White Army didn't stand a chance. Kolchak's forces began a long retreat from which they'd never recover. But Kolchak didn't even live to see the end of it, because, at the city of Irkutsk, he was captured by the Reds and shot. The Red Army had just proven itself far superior to the Red Guard that came before it. But that still might not be good enough, because Kolchak wasn't the greatest threat to the Bolsheviks in Russia. Because right as the Reds were turning the tide against Kolchak, Denikin made his move. But we'll be covering that in part 2, which, when it's out, you'll be able to watch by clicking the link on the top right of your screen.
Thank you.
Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment.
Yeah, okay, so that was a lot. I hope that you were able to follow that one along, because I tried to explain as best as I can, but yeah, wow, that was a lot of information, a lot of detailed information. Let's go have a look at part 2, and again, I'll try and pause and explain of anything that's not clear. So let's go check out part 2. Part 2, let's get into it.
This video is part 2 in a 2-part series.
Thank you.
You can watch part 1 by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. Kolchak and his Siberian White Army may have been defeated, but all is not yet lost. Anton Denikin is about to make his move. But what was he doing all this time? Well, when we last checked in on him, his 40,000 men had just secured the Kuban, so their next move was to push further south and take the North Caucasus. This was fertile ground for counter-revolution. In fact, the Red forces in the area were already stretched thin by the local Cossacks and other nationalist groups. So even though the Reds had more than 3 times as many troops as Denikin, he totally annihilated them. Out of the 150,000 Red Army soldiers in the region, the Whites took 50,000 prisoners, while the rest either deserted or were killed. This was the most serious defeat the Red Army would suffer in the entire war. A key reason for Denikin's success was his superior Cossack cavalry, something which the Reds couldn't deal with, as they had practically no cavalry themselves. You see, the communists were ideologically opposed to mounted troops. They thought it was old-fashioned and aristocratic, preferring industrial warfare fought with artillery, machine guns, and airplanes.
Interesting how at this point, the fact though that obviously they're on the right path, right? And that airplanes and artillery and machine guns would become the war of the future. Interesting, though, how we're at this sort of point in history where the old way and the new way, it hasn't quite fully shifted to the new way yet, right? It's kind of like VHS and Betamax, right? And so that's interesting, actually, how the Bolsheviks, despite trying the new way, the old way is actually still quite effective, and in this case, won them that battle. Interesting.
That was unfortunate, since relatively small armies fighting along massive front lines made the Russian Civil War the ideal environment for mounted troops. Eventually, the Reds would realize their mistake and raise cavalry of their own, but it would take time for them to come online, so until then, the Bolsheviks would have to rely on their conscripted infantry. It was around this point that the Reds were pursuing Kolchak deep into Siberia, and so turned their attention to Denikin and the Cossacks of the Don. Being between the Russian heartland and Denikin, the Cossacks got the worst of it. Most of their forces were scattered, while the survivors joined Denikin. Combined with new recruits from the North Caucasus, Denikin now had an army of 60,000 men. This was the first time that the Southern Whites were led by a single commander, so this newly unified force took on a new name for itself: the Armed Forces of South Russia. The Reds assumed that they had the advantage over the new AFSR. After all, they outnumbered them by around 2-1, but a combination of superior troops and brilliant leadership allowed the Whites to hold their ground. This bought them the time they needed to get supplies from the Allies, who had noticed the AFSR's success and committed to supplying them with everything they needed to launch another offensive. This included artillery, airplanes, and 60 tanks. By June, the Armed Forces of South Russia took Tsaritsyn. That was a major victory.
Okay, wait, okay. So the Black Sea's here, the Caspian, okay, I see. All right, gotcha. Maps are helpful, especially in Civil War videos when borders are changing so quick. Thank you. All right, clear. Now I know what everything is.
It was starting to look like the Whites could
and so this was renamed Stalingrad.
Really win the war. In fact, their Bolshevik enemies were practically helping them do it. You see, during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks ruled over the majority of the Russian population who were concentrated in the nation's industrial heartland.
Yes.
Meanwhile, the Whites controlled the food-producing periphery. So with the Whites in control of the nation's food supply, how did the Bolsheviks feed their citizens? The answer is simple. They didn't. Yeah. It's estimated that a Russian laborer needs 2,700 calories to get through the day. At the start of the Civil War, the rations given out in Petrograd were worth less than 1,400. Women starved too, and in their desperation, as many as 1 in 30 turned to prostitution. Fuel shortages in winter compounded these problems, with citizens being forced to make the choice between food, clothes, or fuel. The Bolshevik solution was as authoritarian as you'd expect. They invented the dictatorship of food supply. This involved sending armed grain requisitioning units to forcibly purchase and sometimes even steal food from the countryside. As communists, they rationalized this as a sort of class war.
And what's interesting too is that unfortunately for the Russian people, it would not really get better. In 1921, there was the Soviet famine. There's this very famous photo of 2 Russian peasants, and they're standing in front of a table, and in front of the table there's human remains on it, actually. And cannibalism was something that, although it's not very well historically documented, there was instances of this happening because of the sheer amount of just the level and how large the famine was of 1921. And though we're not there yet, the Russian people suffered immensely through this civil war and afterwards, all the way leading up to Stalin, who would then go and terrorize 1.5 million people during the Great Purges. And just a terrible place to be in.
The detachments would make a point of turning poorer peasants against their richer neighbors known as kulaks. Naturally.
Yes. So kulaks means, it's sort of an insult kind of, but it's sort of to reference anyone that was sort of like a rich farmer, right? It was used in terms of class. However, Ukrainians were often referred to as kulaks because they had generally the more successful farms because of the fertile agriculture that Ukraine has, and which obviously still continues to this day. And so the kulaks were disproportionately, I think, again, I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but were disproportionately Ukrainian. And this led to actually a lot of resentment, which would eventually lead to the Holodomor, which, again, depending on the historian, but I think at this point it's pretty well established was a intentional famine against the Ukrainian people, which was sort of orchestrated by Stalin and his administration to, sort of, what would you say, crush the will of the Ukrainian people. And it's been recognized. It's not recognized by every country, but for example, Canada recognizes the Holodomor as an act of genocide, right? And there's actually a statue in Toronto that I've seen, which is really, really fascinating, in front of the Princess Gate, that commemorates the victims of the Holodomor, because there are a lot of Ukrainians in Canada. It's actually the second largest group of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine in the world.
The dictatorship of food supply caused the kulaks to put up armed resistance. So not only did this program inspire armed insurgency, but it also failed to solve the food problem. What's even worse is that the way a peasant becomes a kulak was by being a skilled farmer. So the Soviets made it their official policy to attack their own best food producers.
What do you think's going to happen?
As the Civil War went on, the food crisis worsened. By the Civil War's end, millions would die in famines. In such an environment, the Cheka had a lot of work to do. Red Terror was the only means by which the Bolsheviks could maintain their hold on power. A favorite strategy of the Cheka was to exploit Russia's ethnic tensions. Anywhere a previously repressed minority could be found, the Cheka recruited them into top positions, where the oppressed could let out generations of frustration and become the oppressor. The Cheka committed every atrocity imaginable on their victims, torture of every kind, including gouging out eyes, crushing skulls, rape, mock executions, real executions by gunshot, noose, scalding, burning, and crucifixion. The Cheka even operated concentration camps, work camps, and death camps.
Yeah, and so this is obviously very well documented at this point, right? And I don't really have anything to add specifically, but read, for example, the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, and lots and lots and lots of other cases. And although Solzhenitsyn, this was post the World War. Just horrible, horrible, horrible.
In the time Lenin ruled Russia, it's estimated that the Cheka alone killed 100,000 men, women, and children. That's 7 times more than all the Russian Tsars killed in the previous 100 years combined. By
and it would only get worse under Stalin.
September of 1919, after a series of failed counterattacks, the Reds had exhausted all of their offensive power against Denikin. Once again, it was his turn to attack. Now with over 100,000 troops, Denikin issued the Moscow Directive. The plan was for the entire AFSR to fan out along a wide front and take as much of the Russian heartland as fast as possible.
God, these maps, man. Oh, okay, okay.
The best of Denikin's forces were concentrated in the center, which was to march directly on Moscow. But when the operation began, orders weren't properly followed. The Dnieper River was originally supposed to guard the army's left flank. AFSR forces were only supposed to take bridgeheads along their advance. But instead, local commanders chose to push deep into Ukraine. White forces stationed in the Crimea launched their own invasion of Ukraine from the south, and a third force landed in Odessa. This invasion captured major cities, including Odessa and Kiev, but it also occupied between 10 and 15,000 troops. On the one hand, Ukraine was a resource-rich and densely populated country that could massively aid the war effort. On the other hand, the whole point of the Moscow Directive was to end the war now. Those soldiers were needed in Russia, not Ukraine. But it wasn't all bad news. As Denikin's forces marched closer to Moscow, seemingly out of nowhere, another white army appeared in Estonia and marched on Petrograd. In Russia's former territories of Finland and the Baltics, civil wars between Reds and Whites played out in miniature.
Yes, so the Finnish Civil War, right? This was a very brief war. However, there was actually a pro-Bolshevik, the Finnish Reds versus the Finnish Whites, and Mannerheim, probably the most famous general of all time, who really was launched to international recognition during the Civil War. He was a general during this time, and then would go on to become Finland's most famous general during World War II. And I was actually able to see some of the factories, the former factories where the Finnish Reds conducted their planning and their organization in Helsinki while I was there. So that was kind of cool.
Resulting in white victories across the map. Unfortunately for the Russians, these white movements were nationalist. So when Russian exiles came asking for help in their civil war, the nationalists had one question for them. If the Russian whites win, will the breakaway states have to reintegrate? The exiles answered that of course they would. That was not the right answer. However, as much as the nationalists disliked the Russian whites, they hated the communists even more. So Finland, and later Estonia, were willing to host the so-called Northwestern Army. Leading this force of 17,000 exiles was General Yudenich, a hero of the First World War. This force was well supplied by the Allies, with the British even giving them 6 tanks. When Yudenich broke out of Estonia and made his advance toward Petrograd, Soviet leadership
By the way, Petrograd is St. Petersburg.
panicked. Denikin was crushing them in the south, and now Petrograd, the heart of the revolution, was under attack. The Bolsheviks thought they had to abandon the city, but Leon Trotsky insisted otherwise. He actually agreed with their near-hopeless assessment of the situation, but he also believed that it would be wrong to give up the city without a fight.
What was the turning point
He
then?
personally traveled to the city and used his skill as an orator to fire up its people, raising their morale to a level where they'd be willing to fight off the whites. With morale restored, the military situation actually looked really good for the Bolsheviks. By the time Yudenich reached the Petrograd suburbs, he only had 14,400 men left, and the British had withdrawn their tanks. Meanwhile, the Reds had over 70,000 troops. So after a failed assault against the city, Yudenich found himself at risk of getting encircled. So the Northwestern Army retreated back into Estonia, where officials there disarmed him. The Northwestern Army may have been a failure, but Denikin was in no position to complain about it. He needed all the help he could get. When the Moscow Directive was first issued, one of Denikin's top generals, Wrangel, voiced his objections. Wrangel argued that an offensive toward Moscow would be suicidal. Their supply lines were already stretched and under constant attack from partisans who only existed because the whites were unpopular with the Russian people. Russia wanted land reform. The Bolsheviks had already promised it to them, but it also came with much less popular reforms like the dictatorship of food supply.
Right, and this is what Oversimplified said in his video, is that while, the whites were able to get Russian soldiers, to put it very, very simply, the Reds were actually to win over the workers, right, and to win over the population. And so, that's quite interesting. I wonder if there was certain populations that were more sympathetic to the white cause. I don't know. Let me know below if you know by chance.
So Wrangel believed that if the whites only declared themselves in favor of land reform, the Russian people would flock to their cause. But Denikin, like all the other white leaders, refused to acknowledge the political aspect of the conflict. Wrangel was probably the only white leader who took it seriously. The AFSR had been led by great military commanders from the start, but what set Wrangel apart was that he was their only commander who prevented his men from looting liberated territories. Meanwhile, the other white
they're looting themselves?
Generals looted at will, and their men followed that example. Sometimes, the generals themselves would host pogroms. If the locals were unwilling to flee into the hands of the Bolsheviks, they joined Makhno's anarchist Black Army, who were
Why is Israel there?
in an alliance with the Bolsheviks to stop Denikin.
What?
They were responsible for some of the worst damage to his supply lines. One white general, Meymaevsky, was particularly egregious.
Why was Israel there? Why was there an Israel? Am I missing something? Israel was not declared until 1951, maybe 1947. Okay.
He was one of their best commanders, but also an alcoholic, enthusiastic looter, and his headquarters was always full of women, which outraged his subordinates.
Nice.
But he probably couldn't hear them over all the orgies he was hosting. But, in spite of all these very real problems, Denikin had to launch the offensive. Everything Wrangel said was true, but there just wasn't any time to reform the army. Every day, the Bolsheviks were getting stronger, and Wrangel's reforms would not have been enough to offset the Bolsheviks' increasing strength. And so, just like happened to Kolchak, with supply lines overextended and chaos in the rear, the AFSR's offensive capabilities were exhausted 205 miles south of Moscow. The Reds counterattacked with their new elite cavalry, closing in around Denikin's flanks. To prevent encirclement, the central thrust toward Moscow pulled back. A long retreat to the Caucasus followed. By December,
a long retreat, that's hundreds, thousands of kilometers.
The whites lost Kiev, and in January of 1920, they lost Tsaritsyn. Denikin was right back where he started in the Don and the Kuban. In February, he managed to launch a briefly successful counterattack, but all that did was delay the inevitable. So with overwhelming Red forces coming in against them, the White Army retreated to the Crimean Peninsula, and its commanders fell to political infighting. But the Bolsheviks didn't have a Black Sea fleet yet, so the White Army in Crimea could hold the peninsula for quite some time. And, while demoralized, they still numbered over 30,000 men. But for our purposes, the Russian Civil War was basically over. So don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell.
But what happened? They'd siege Kiev?
If you'd like to help us make more videos like this one, support us through Patreon, Subscribestar, becoming a channel member, and PayPal, links to all of which can be found below. Up next, one white general still isn't totally convinced that the war is lost. So we're going to talk about his efforts in the last great effort to save Russia from communism, led by a man who always served with honor. I'll see you then.
Okay, well, maybe I'll check out that video. Let's see. Let me know in the comments below. I'm definitely going to look up what happened, because you have 30,000 men that are basically sieging Kiev. I mean, obviously they did eventually lose, but I'm really curious about that story. Hope you guys like this one. I think the first part was, at least for me, a little bit more confusing. Let me know below, but the second part was actually a little bit more clear, and I quite like that. It went more into the detail. It wasn't just a broad overview, but I think that maybe in part one, if they had established it a little better. But hey, anyways, let me know what you guys thought. Thank you very much for joining me. The next one will either be, if you guys want it, let me know down below, that exact video from CallMeEzekiel, or we'll just cap off the country series here, and we will talk about Geography Now, Russia. Thank you all very much again. Take care. See you guys in the next video.